Well, good evening. Here we are. I hope you're getting all set to take care of yourselves with this heat wave coming. In any event, tonight I've got my overhead fan going and it's time for tales and cocktails. So tonight is part 3 of Jane Austen's Persuasion. And we'll just get right into it. The party at the great house was sometimes increased by other company. The neighborhood was not large, but the Musgroves were visited by everybody and had more dinner parties and more callers, more visitors by invitation and by chance than any other family. They were more completely popular. The girls were wild for dancing, and the evenings ended occasionally in an unpremeditated little ball. There was a family of cousins within a walk of Uppercross in less affluent circumstances, who depended on the Musgroves for all their pleasures. They would come at any time and help play at anything or dance anywhere, and Anne, very much preferring the office of musician to a more active post, played country dances to them by the hour together. A kindness which always recommended her musical powers to the notice of Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove more than anything else, and often drew this compliment: "Well done, Miss Anne, very well done indeed. Lord bless me, how those little fingers of yours fly about." So passed the first 3 weeks. Michaelmas came, and now Anne's heart must be in Kellynch again. A beloved home, made over to others. All the precious rooms and furniture, groves and prospects, beginning to own other eyes and other limbs. She could not think of much else on the 29th of September, and she had this sympathetic touch in the evening from Mary, who, on having occasion to note down the day of the month, exclaimed, "Dear me, is not this the day the Crofts were to come to Kellynch? I'm glad I did not think of it before. How low it makes me." The Crofts took possession with true naval alertness and were to be visited. Mary deplored the necessity for herself. Nobody knew how much she should suffer. She should put it off as long as she could, but was not easy till she had talked Charles into driving her over on an early day, and was in a very animated, comfortable state of imaginary agitation when she came back. Anne had very sincerely rejoiced in there being no means of her going. She wished, however, to see the Crofts, and was glad to be within when the visit was returned. They came. The master of the house was not at home, but the 2 sisters were together, and as it chanced that Mrs. Croft fell to the share of Anne, while the Admiral sat by Mary and made himself very agreeable by his good-humored notice of her little boys, she was well able to watch for a likeness, and if it failed her in the features, to catch it in the voice or the turn of sentiment and expression. Mrs. Croft, though neither tall nor fat, had a squareness, uprightness, and vigor of form which gave importance to her person. She had bright, dark eyes, good teeth, and altogether an agreeable face, though her reddened and weather-beaten complexion, the consequence of her having been almost as much at sea as her husband, made her seem to have lived some years longer in the world than her real 38. Her manners were open, easy, and decided, like one who had no distrust of herself and no doubts of what to do, without any approach to coarseness, however, or any want of good humor. Anne gave her credit, indeed, for feelings of great consideration towards herself in all that related to Kellynch, and it pleased her, especially as she had satisfied herself in the very first half-minute, in the instant even of introduction, that there was not the smallest symptom of any knowledge or suspicion on Mrs. Croft's her side, to give a bias of any sort. She was quite easy on that head, and consequently full of strength and courage, till for a moment electrified by Mrs. Croft suddenly saying, "It was you, and not your sister, I find, that my brother had the pleasure of being acquainted with when he was in this country." Anne hoped she had outlived the age of blushing, but the age of emotion she certainly had not. "Perhaps she may not have heard that he is married," added Mrs. Croft. She could now answer as she ought, and was happy to feel, when Mrs. Croft's next words explained it to be Mr. Wentworth of whom she spoke, that she had said nothing which might not do for either brother. She immediately felt how reasonable it was that Mrs. Croft should be thinking and speaking of Edward, and not of Frederick, and with shame at her own forgetfulness, applied herself to the knowledge of their former neighbor's present state with proper interest. The rest was all tranquility, till just as they were moving, she heard the Admiral say to Mary, "We are expecting a brother of Mrs. Croft's here soon. I dare say you know him by name." He was cut short by the eager attacks of the little boys, clinging to him like an old friend and declaring he should not go, and being too much engrossed by proposals of carrying them away in his coat pocket, etc., to have another moment for finishing or recollecting what he had begun. Anne was left to persuade herself, as well as she could, that the same brother must be in question. She could not, however, reach such a degree of certainty as not to be anxious to hear whether anything had been said on the subject at the other house, where the Crofts had previously been calling. The folks of Great House were to spend the evening of this stay at the cottage, and it being now too late in the year for such visits to be made on foot, the coach was beginning to be listened for when the youngest Miss Musgrove walked in. That she was coming to apologize, and they should have to spend the evening by themselves, was the first black idea, and Mary was quite ready to be affronted when Louisa made all right by saying that she only came on foot to leave more room for the harp, which was bringing in the carriage. "And I will tell you our reason," she added, "and all about it. I am come up to give you notice that Papa and Mamma are out of spirits this evening, especially Mamma. She is thinking so much of poor Richard, and we agreed it would be best to have the harp, for it seems to amuse her more than the pianoforte. I will tell you why she is out of spirits. When the Crofts called this morning, they called here afterwards, did not they? They happened to say that her brother, Captain Wentworth, is just returned to England, or paid off or something, and is coming to see them almost directly. And most unluckily, it came into Mamma's head when they were gone that Wentworth, or something very like it, was the name of poor Richard's captain at one time. I do not know when or where, but a great while before he died, poor fellow. And upon looking over his letters and things, she found it was so, and is perfectly sure that this must be the very man, and her head is quite full of it and of poor Richard. So we must all be as merry as we can, that she may not be dwelling upon such gloomy things." The real circumstances of this pathetic piece of family history were that the Musgroves had had the ill fortune of a very troublesome, hopeless son, and the good fortune to lose him before he reached his 20th year. That he had been sent to sea, because he was stupid and unmanageable on shore. That he had been very little cared for at any time by his family, though quite as much as he deserved. Seldom heard of, and scarcely at all regretted, when the intelligence of his death abroad had worked its way to Uppercross 2 years before. He had, in fact, though his sisters were now doing all they could for him by calling him poor Richard, been nothing better than a thick-headed, unfeeling, unprofitable Dick Musgrove, who had never done anything to entitle himself to more than the abbreviation of his name, living or dead. He had been several years at sea, and had, in the course of those removals, to which all midshipmen are liable, and especially such midshipmen as every captain wishes to get rid of, been 6 months on board Captain Frederick Wentworth's frigate, the Laconia, and from the Laconia he had, under the influence of his captain, written the only 2 letters which his father and mother had ever received from him during the whole of his absence. That is to say, the only 2 disinterested letters. All the rest had been mere applications for money. In each letter he had spoken well of his captain, but yet so little were they in the habit of attending to such matters, so unobservant and incurious were they as to the names of men or ships, that it had made scarcely any impression at the time, and that Mrs. Musgrove should have been suddenly struck this very day with the recollection of the name of Wentworth as connected with her son, seemed one of those extraordinary bursts of mind which do sometimes occur. She had gone to her letters and found it all as she supposed, and the reperusal of these letters, after so long an interval, her poor son gone forever, and all the strength of his faults forgotten, had affected her spirits exceedingly, and thrown her into greater grief for him than she had known on first hearing of his death. Mr. Musgrove was, in a lesser degree, affected likewise, and when they reached the cottage they were evidently in want first of being listened to anew on this subject, and afterwards of all the relief which cheerful companions could give. To hear them talking so much of Captain Wentworth, repeating his name so often, puzzling over past years, and at last ascertaining that it probably would, turn out to be the very same Captain Wentworth whom they recollected meeting once or twice after their coming back from Clifton. A very fine young man, but they could not say whether it was 7 or 8 years ago. It was a new sort of trial to Anne's nerves. She found, however, that it was one to which she must inure herself. Since he actually was expected in the country, she must teach herself to be insensible on such points. And not only did it appear that he was expected, and speedily, but the Musgroves, in their warm gratitude for the kindness he had shown poor Dick, and very high respect for his character, stamped as it was by poor Dick's having been 6 months under his care, and mentioning him in strong, though not perfectly well spelt praise, as a fine dashing fellow, only too particular about the schoolmaster, were bent on introducing themselves and seeking his acquaintance as soon as they could hear of his arrival. The resolution of doing so helped to form the comfort of their evening. A very few days more, and Captain Wentworth was known to be at Kellynch, and Mr. Musgrove had called on him and come back warm in his praise, and he was engaged with the Crofts to dine at Uppercross by the end of another week. It had been a great disappointment to Mr. Musgrove to find that no earlier day could be fixed. So impatient was he to show his gratitude by seeing Captain Wentworth under his own roof and welcoming him to all that was strongest and best in his cellars. But a week must pass, only a week, in Anne's reckoning, and then, she supposed, they must meet. And soon she began to wish that she could feel secure even for a week. Captain Wentworth made a very early return to Mr. Musgrove's civility, and she was all but calling there in the same half hour. She and Mary were actually setting forward for the great house, where, as she afterwards learnt, they must inevitably have found him when they were stopped by the oldest boys being at that moment brought home in consequence of a bad fall. The child's situation put the visit entirely aside, but she could not hear of her escape with indifference, even in the midst of the serious anxiety which they afterwards felt on his account. His collarbone was found to be dislocated, and such injury received in the back as roused the most alarming ideas. It was an afternoon of distress, and Anne had everything to do at once. The apothecary to send for, the father to have pursued and informed, the mother to support and keep from hysterics, the servants to control, the youngest child to banish, and the poor suffering one to attend and soothe, besides sending, as soon as she recollected it, proper notice to the other house, which brought her an accession rather of frightened, enquiring companions than of very useful assistants. Her brother's return was the first comfort. He could best take care of his wife, and the second blessing was the arrival of the apothecary. Till he came and had examined the child, their apprehensions were the worst for being vague. They suspected great injury, but knew not where. And now the collarbone was soon replaced, and though Mr. Robinson felt and rubbed and looked grave and spoke low words to both the father and the aunt, still they were all to hope for the best, and to be able to part and eat their dinner in tolerable ease of mind. And then it was just before they parted that the two young aunts were able so far to digress from their nephew's state as to give the information of Captain Wentworth's visit, staying 5 minutes behind their father and mother to endeavor to impress how perfectly delighted they were with him, how much handsomer, how infinitely more agreeable they thought him than any individual among their male acquaintance who had been at all a favorite before. How glad they had been to hear Papa invite him to stay dinner. How sorry when he said it was quite out of his power. And how glad again when he had promised to reply to Papa and Mamma's farther pressing invitation to come and dine with them on the morrow. Actually on the morrow. And he had promised it in so pleasant a manner, as if he felt all the motive of their attention just as he ought. And in short, he had looked and said everything with such exquisite grace that they could assure them all their heads were both turned by him. And off they ran, quite as full of glee as of love, and apparently more full of Captain Wentworth than of little Charles. The same story and the same raptures were repeated when the two girls came with their father through the gloom of the evening to make inquiries. And Mr. Musgrove, no longer under the first uneasiness about his heir, could add his confirmation and praise, and hope that there would be now no occasion for putting Captain Wentworth off, and only be sorry to think that the cottage party probably would not like to leave the little boy to give him the meeting. Oh, no, as to leaving the little boy, both father and mother were in much too strong and recent alarm to bear the thought, and Anne, in the joy of the escape, could not help adding her warm protestations to theirs. Charles Musgrove, indeed, afterwards showed more of inclination. The child was going on so well, and he wished so much to be introduced to Captain Wentworth, that perhaps he might join them in the evening. He would not dine from home, but he might walk in for half an hour. But in this he was eagerly opposed by his wife with, "Oh, no, indeed, Charles, I cannot bear to have you go away. Only think if anything should happen." The child had a good night and was going on well the next day. It must be a work of time to ascertain that no injury had been done to the spine, but Mr. Robinson found nothing to increase alarm, and Charles Musgrove began consequently to feel no necessity for longer confinement. The child was to be kept in bed and amused as quietly as possible. But what was there for a father to do? This was quite a female case, and it would be highly absurd in him, who could be of no use at home, to shut himself up. His father very much wished him to meet Captain Wentworth, and there being no sufficient reason against it, he ought to go. And it ended in his making a bold public declaration, when he came in from shooting, of his meaning to dress directly and dine at the other house. "Nothing can be going on better than the child," said he, "so I told my father just now that I would come, and he thought me quite right. Your sister being with you, my love, I have no scruple at all. You would not like to leave him yourself, but you see I can be of no use. Anne will send for me if anything is the matter." Husbands and wives generally understand when opposition will be vain. Mary knew from Charles's manner of speaking that he was quite determined on going, and that it would be of no use to tease him. She said nothing, therefore, till he was out of the room, but as soon as there was only Anne to hear, "So, you and I are to be left to shift by ourselves with this poor sick child, and not a creature coming near us all the evening. I knew how it would be. This is always my luck. If there is anything disagreeable going on, men are always sure to get out of it, and Charles is as bad as any of them. Very unfeeling. I must say it is very unfeeling of him to be running away from his poor little boy. Talks of his going on so well. How does he know that he's going on well, or that there may not be a sudden change half an hour hence? I did not think Charles would have been so unfeeling. So, here he is to go away and enjoy himself, and because I am the poor mother, I am not allowed to stir. And yet I am sure I am more unfit than anybody else to be about the child. My being the mother is the very reason why my feelings should not be tried. I am not at all equal to it. You saw how hysterical I was yesterday. But that was only the effect of the suddenness of your alarm, of the shock. You will not be hysterical again. I dare say we shall have nothing to distress us. I perfectly understand Mr. Robinson's directions and have no fears. And indeed, Mary, I cannot wonder at your husband. Nursing does not belong to a man. It is not his province. A sick child is always the mother's property. Her own feelings generally make it so. I hope I am as fond of my child as any mother, but I do not know that I have any more use in the sick room than Charles, for I cannot be always scolding and teasing a poor child when it is ill. And you saw this morning, if I told him to keep quiet, he was sure to begin kicking about. I have not nerves for this sort of thing. But could you be comfortable yourself to be spending the whole evening away from the poor boy? Yes, you see his papa can, and why should not I? Jemima is so careful, and she could send us word every hour how he was. I really think Charles might as well have told his father we would all come. I am not more alarmed about little Charles now than he is. I was dreadfully alarmed yesterday, but the case is very different today. Well, if you do not think it too late to give notice for yourself, suppose you were to go, as well as your husband. Leave little Charles to my care. Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove cannot think it wrong while I remain with him. Are you serious? Cried Mary, her eyes brightening. Dear me, that's a very good thought. Very good indeed. Then to be sure I may just as well go as not, for I am of no use at home, am I? and it only harasses me. You, who have not a mother's feelings, are a great deal the properest person. You can make little Charles do anything. He always minds you at a word. It will be a great deal better than leaving him with only Jemima. Oh, I will certainly go. I am sure I ought if I can, quite as much as Charles, for they want me excessively to be acquainted with Captain Wentworth, and I know you do not mind being left alone. An excellent thought of yours, indeed, Anne. I will go and tell Charles and get ready directly. You can send for us, you know, at a moment's notice, if anything is the matter, but I dare say there will be nothing to alarm you. I should not go, you may be sure, if I did not feel quite at ease about my dear child. The next moment she was tapping at her husband's dressing-room door, and as Anne followed her upstairs, she was in time for the whole conversation, which began with Mary's saying in a tone of great exultation, "I mean to go with you, Charles, for I am of no more use at home than you are. If I were to shut myself up forever with the child, I should not be able to persuade him to do anything he did not like. Anne will stay. Anne undertakes to stay at home and take care of him. It is Anne's own proposal, and so I shall go with you, which will be a great deal better, for I have not dined in the other house since Tuesday." "That is very kind of Anne," was her husband's answer, "and I should be very glad to have you go, but it seems rather hard that she should be left at home by herself to nurse our sick child." Anne was now at hand to take up her own cause, and the sincerity of her manner being soon sufficient to convince him, where conviction was at least very agreeable, he had no farther scruples as to her being left to dine alone, although he still wanted her to join them in the evening, when the child might be at rest for the night, and kindly urged her to let him come and fetch her. But she was quite unpersuadable, and this being the case, she had ere long the pleasure of seeing them set off together in high spirits. They were gone, she hoped, to be happy, however oddly constructed such happiness might seem. As for herself, she was left with as many sensations of comfort as were perhaps ever likely to be hers. She knew herself to be of the first utility to the child, and what was it to her if Frederick Wentworth were only half a mile distant, making himself agreeable to others? She would have liked to know how he felt as to a meeting. Perhaps indifferent, if indifference could exist under such circumstances. He must be either indifferent or unwilling. Had he wished ever to see her again, he need not have waited till this time. He would have done what she could not but believe that in his place she would have done long ago, when events had been early giving him the independence which alone had been wanting. Her brother and sister came back delighted with their new acquaintance and their visit in general. There had been music, singing, talking, laughing, all that was most agreeable. Charming manners in Captain Wentworth, no shyness or reserve. They seemed all to know each other perfectly, and he was coming the very next morning to shoot with Charles. He was to come to breakfast, but not at the cottage, though that had been proposed at first. But then he had been pressed to come to the great house instead, and he seemed afraid of being in Mrs. Charles Musgrove's way on account of the child, and therefore, somehow, they hardly knew how, it ended in Charles's being to meet him to breakfast at his father's. Anne understood it. He wished to avoid seeing her. He had inquired after her, she found, slightly, as might suit a former slight acquaintance, seeming to acknowledge such as she had acknowledged, actuated perhaps by the same view of escaping introduction when they were to meet. The morning hours of the cottage were always later than those of the other house, and on the morrow the difference was so great that Mary and Anne were not more than beginning breakfast when Charles came in to say that they were just setting off, that he was come for his dogs, that his sisters were following with Captain Wentworth. His sisters meaning to visit Mary and the child, and Captain Wentworth proposing also to wait on her for a few minutes, if not inconvenient. And though Charles had answered for the child's being in no such state as could make it inconvenient, Captain Wentworth would not be satisfied without his running on to give notice. Mary, very much gratified by this attention, was delighted to receive him, while 1,000 feelings rushed on Anne, of which this was the most consoling, that it would soon be over. And it was soon over. In 2 minutes after Charles's preparation, the others appeared. They were in the drawing room. Her eye half met Captain Wentworth's. A bow, a curtsy passed. She heard his voice. He talked to Mary, said all that was right, said something to the Miss Musgroves, enough to mark an easy footing. The room seemed full of persons and voices, but a few minutes ended it. Charles showed himself at the window. All was ready. Their visitor had bowed and was gone. The Miss Musgroves were gone too, suddenly resolving to walk to the end of the village with the sportsmen. The room was cleared, and Anne might finish her breakfast as she could. "It is over. It is over," she repeated to herself again and again in nervous gratitude. "The worst is over." Mary talked, but she could not attend. She had seen him. They had met. They had been once more in the same room. Soon, however, she began to reason with herself and try to be feeling less. 8 years, almost 8 years had passed since all had been given up. How absurd to be resuming the agitation which such an interval had banished into distance and indistinctness. What might not 8 years do? Events of every description, changes, alienations, removals, all must be comprised in it. And oblivion of the past, how natural, how certain too. It included nearly a third part of her own life. Alas, with all her reasonings, she found that to retentive feelings, 8 years may be a little more than nothing. Now, how were his sentiments to be read? Was this like wishing to avoid her? And the next moment she was hating herself for the folly which asked the question. On one other question, which perhaps her utmost wisdom might not have prevented, she was soon spared all suspense. For after the Miss Musgroves had returned and finished their visit at the cottage, she had this spontaneous information from Mary. "Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne, though he was so attentive to me. Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said you were so altered he should not have known you again." Mary had no feelings to make her respect her sisters in a common way, but she was perfectly unsuspicious of inflicting any peculiar wound. Altered beyond his knowledge. Anne fully submitted, in silent, deep mortification. Doubtless it was so, and she could take no revenge, for he was not altered, or not for the worse. She had already acknowledged it to herself, and she could not think differently. Let him think of her as he would. No, the years which had destroyed her youth and bloom had only given him a more glowing, manly, open look, in no respect lessening his personal advantages. she had seen the same Frederick Wentworth, so altered that he should not have known her again. These were words that could not but dwell with her. Yet she soon began to rejoice that she had heard them. They were of sobering tendency. They allayed agitation. They composed, and consequently must make her happier. Frederick Wentworth had used such words or something like them, but without an idea that they would be carried round to her. He had thought her wretchedly altered, and in the first moment of appeal had spoken as he felt. He had not forgiven Anne Elliot. She had used him ill, deserted and disappointed him, and worse, she had shown a feebleness of character in doing so, which his own decided, confident temper could not endure. She had given him up to oblige others. It had been the effect of over-persuasion. It had been weakness and timidity. He had been most warmly attached to her, and had never seen a woman since whom he thought her equal. But, except from some natural sensation of curiosity, he had no desire of meeting her again. Her power with him was gone forever. It was now his object to marry. He was rich, and being turned on shore, fully intended to settle as soon as he could be properly tempted, actually looking round, ready to fall in love with all the speed which a clear head and quick taste could allow. He had a heart for either of the Miss Musgroves, if they could catch it. A heart, in short, for any pleasing young woman who came in his way, excepting Anne Elliot. This was his only secret exception. When he said to his sister, in answer to her suppositions, "Yes, here I am, Sophia, quite ready to make a foolish match. Anybody between 15 and 30 may have me for asking. A little beauty and a few smiles and a few compliments to the Navy, and I am a lost man. Should not this be enough for a sailor who has had no society among women to make him nice?" He said it, she knew, to be contradicted. His bright, proud eyes spoke the happy conviction that he was nice, and Anne Elliot was not out of his thoughts when he more seriously described the woman he would wish to meet with. A strong mind with sweetness of manner made the first and the last of the description. "This is the woman I want," said he. "Something a little inferior I shall of course put up with, but it must not be much. If I am a fool, I shall be a fool indeed, for I have thought on the subject more than most men." From this time, excuse me just 1 second, I have misplaced something. Let me get it. Okay. No, just carry on. I've lost track of the time, but I'm sure we're all right. From this time, Captain Wentworth and Anne Elliot were repeatedly in the same circle. They were soon dining in company together at Mr. Musgrove's, for the little boy's state could no longer supply his aunt with a pretense for absenting herself, and this was but the beginning of other dinings and other meetings. Whether former feelings were to be renewed must be brought to the proof. Former times must undoubtedly be brought to the recollection of each. They could not but be reverted to. The year of their engagement could not but be named by him in the little narratives or descriptions which conversation called forth. His profession qualified him, his disposition led him to talk. That was in the year 6. That happened before I went to sea in the year 6. Occurred in the course of the first evening they spent together. And though his voice did not falter, and though she had no reason to suppose his eye wandering towards her while he spoke, Anne felt the utter impossibility from her knowledge of his mind that he could be unvisited by remembrance any more than herself. There must be the same immediate association of thought, though she was very far from conceiving it to be of equal pain. They had no conversation together, no intercourse but what the commonest civility required. Often so much to each other. Now nothing. There had been a time when of all the large party now filling the drawing room at Uppercross, they would have found it most difficult to cease to speak to one another, with the exception, perhaps, of Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who seemed particularly attached and happy. Anne could allow no other exception even among the married couples. There could have been no two hearts so open, no tastes so similar, no feelings so in unison, no countenances so beloved. Now they were as strangers. Nay, worse than strangers, for they could never become acquainted. It was a perpetual estrangement. When he talked, she heard the same voice and discerned the same mind. There was a very general ignorance of all naval matters throughout the party, and he was very much questioned, and especially by the two Miss Musgroves, who seemed hardly to have any eyes but for him. As to the manner of living on board, daily regulations, food, hours, etc., and their surprise at his accounts, at learning the degree of accommodation and arrangement which was practicable, drew from him some pleasant ridicule, which reminded Anne of the early days when she too had been ignorant, and she too had been accused of supposing sailors to be living on board without anything to eat, or any cook to dress it if there were, or any servant to wait, or any knife and fork to use. From thus listening and thinking, she was roused by a whisper of Mrs. Musgrove's, who, overcome by fond regrets, could not help saying, "Ah, Miss Anne, if it had pleased heaven to spare my poor son, I dare say he would have been just such another by this time." Anne suppressed a smile and listened kindly, while Mrs. Musgrove relieved her heart a little more, and for a few minutes, therefore, could not keep pace with the conversation of the others. When she could let her attention take its natural course again, she found the Miss Musgroves just fetching the Navy list, their own Navy list, the first that had ever been at Uppercross, and sitting down together to pore over it with the professed view of finding out the ships which Captain Wentworth had commanded. "Your first was the Asp, I remember. We will look for the Asp." "You will not find her there. Quite worn out and broken up. I was the last man who commanded her. Hardly fit for service then. Reported fit for home service for a year or two. And so I was sent off to the West Indies." The girls looked all amazement. "The Admiralty," he continued, "entertain themselves now and then with sending a few hundred men to sea in a ship not fit to be employed. But they have a great many to provide for, and among the thousands that may just as well go to the bottom as not, it is impossible for them to distinguish the very set who may be least missed." "Phoo! Phoo!" cried the Admiral. "What stuff these young fellows talk! Never was a better ship than the Asp in her day. For an old-built sloop, you would not see her equal. Lucky fellow to get her. He knows there must have been 20 better men than himself applying for her at the same time. Lucky fellow to get anything so soon, with no more interest than his." "I felt my luck, Admiral, I assure you," replied Captain Wentworth seriously. "I was as well satisfied with my appointment as you can desire. It was a great object with me at that time to be at sea, a very great object. I wanted to be doing something." "To be sure you did. What should a young fellow like you do ashore for half a year together? If a man has not a wife, he soon wants to be afloat again." "But, Captain Wentworth," cried Louisa, "how vexed you must have been when you came to the Asp, to see what an old thing they had given you." "I knew pretty well what she was before that day," said he, smiling. "I had no more discoveries to make than you have as to the fashion and strength of any old pelisse, which you have seen lent about among half your acquaintance, ever since you could remember, and which at last, on some very wet day, is lent to yourself. Ah, she was a dear old asp to me. She did all that I wanted. I knew she would. I knew that we should go either to the bottom together, or that she would be the making of me. And I never had 2 days of foul weather all the time I was at sea in her. And after taking privateers enough to be very entertaining, I had the good luck in my passage home the next autumn to fall in with the very French frigate I wanted. I brought her into Plymouth. And here was another instance of luck. We had not been 6 hours in the Sound when a gale came on, which lasted 4 days and nights, and which would have done for poor old Asp in half the time. Our touch with the great nation not having much improved our condition. 24 hours later, and I should only have been a gallant Captain Wentworth in a small paragraph at one corner of the newspapers. And being lost in only a sloop, nobody would have thought about me. Anne's shudderings were for herself alone. But the Miss Musgroves could be as open as they were sincere in their exclamations of pity and horror. "And so then, I suppose," said Mrs. Musgrove in a low voice, as if thinking aloud, "so then he went away to the Laconia, and there he met with our poor boy. Charles, my dear," beckoning him to her, "do ask Captain Wentworth where it was he first met with your poor brother. I always forget." "It was at Gibraltar, mother." "I know. Dick had been left ill at Gibraltar with a recommendation from his former captain to Captain Wentworth." "Oh, but Charles, tell Captain Wentworth he need not be afraid of mentioning poor Dick before me, for it would be rather a pleasure to hear him talked of by such a good friend." Charles, being somewhat more mindful of the probabilities of the case, only nodded in reply and walked away. The girls were now hunting for the Laconia, and Captain Wentworth could not deny himself the pleasure of taking the precious volume into his own hands to save them the trouble, and once more read aloud the little statement of her name and rate and present non-commissioned class, observing over it that she, too, had been one of the best friends man ever had. Ah, those were the days, the pleasant days, when I had the Laconia. How fast I made money in her. A friend of mine and I had such a lovely cruise together off the Western Islands. Poor Harville, sister, you know how much he wanted money, worse than myself. He had a wife. Excellent fellow. I shall never forget his happiness. He felt it all so much for her sake. I wished for him again the next summer when I had still the same luck in the Mediterranean. "And I am sure, sir," said Mrs. Musgrove, "it was a lucky day for us when you were put captain into that ship. We shall never forget what you did." Her feelings made her speak low, and Captain Wentworth, hearing only in part, and probably not having Dick Musgrove at all near his thoughts, looked rather in suspense, as if waiting for more. "My brother," whispered one of the girls, "Mamma is thinking of poor Richard." "Poor dear fellow," continued Mrs. Musgrove. "He was grown so steady, and such an excellent correspondent, while he was under your care. Oh, it would have been a happy thing if he had never left you." I assure you, Captain Wentworth, we are very sorry he ever left you. There was a momentary expression in Captain Wentworth's face at this speech, a certain glance of his bright eye and curl of his handsome mouth, which convinced Anne that instead of sharing in Mrs. Musgrove's kind wishes as to her son, he had probably been at some pains to get rid of him. But it was too transient and indulgent of self-amusement to be detected by any who understood him less than herself. In another moment he was perfectly collected and serious, and almost instantly afterward, coming up to the sofa on which she and Mrs. Musgrove were sitting, took a place by the latter and entered into conversation with her in a low voice about her son, doing it with so much sympathy and natural grace as showed the kindest consideration for all that was real and unobserved in the parents' feelings. And that is part 3 of Jane Austen's Persuasion. Thank you, my dears. We'll continue next Wednesday at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails. Thank you for joining me. Good night.